The lawyer's voice echoed through the mahogany-paneled office as he read my father's will, each word falling like a stone into still water. To my son, Alexander Whitmore, I leave the sum of $25 million, all real estate holdings, and my position as CEO of Whitmore Industries. The room seemed to tilt as I watched my brother's lips curl into that familiar smirk, the one he'd perfected since we were children. And to my daughter, Emma Whitmore, I leave the contents of Safety Deposit Box 447 at First National Bank. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by my stepmother Victoria's barely suppressed laugh. I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, feeling the weight of 23 years of being the family disappointment crystallize into this single, humiliating moment. The forgotten daughter who couldn't live up to the Whitmore legacy had been given exactly what they all thought I deserved, nothing but dusty memories in a box. If you're watching this because you've ever felt invisible in your own family, like your worth was measured by standards you could never meet, then please stay with me, because what I found in that safety deposit box didn't just change my inheritance, it rewrote everything I thought I knew about my family, my father, and most importantly, myself. Sometimes the greatest treasures aren't measured in dollars, and the most powerful truths hide in the places no one thinks to look. My name is Emma, though in the Whitmore household, I was more often referred to as the disappointment, or, on Victoria's kinder days, Robert's little mistake. While my older brother Alex was groomed from birth to take over our father's empire, I was the quiet girl who preferred books to board meetings, art galleries to stock portfolios. My mother had died when I was 3, leaving me with nothing but fragments of memories. The scent of lavender, a soft voice singing lullabies, warm hands braiding my hair. My father remarried Victoria 2 years later, and she brought with her a vision of what the perfect Whitmore family should look like. I didn't fit that vision. The morning after the will reading, I drove to First National Bank in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, the car that had been a source of endless mockery at family dinners. "Emma still driving that rust bucket?" Alex would say, jangling the keys to his latest Ferrari. "Some of us value substance over style," I'd reply, though we both knew it was less about values and more about the teaching salary that barely covered my rent. Yes, I was a teacher, another source of family shame. While Alex closed million-dollar deals, I taught literature to high school students in the inner city, coming home covered in chalk dust and carrying stacks of papers to grade. The bank manager, Mr. Harrison, led me to the vault with the kind of pitying look I'd grown accustomed to over the years. Everyone in our Connecticut town knew the Whitmore family dynamics. They'd all heard about Robert Whitmore's brilliant son who'd graduated from Harvard Business School at 21, and his daughter who'd thrown away her opportunities to attend a state school and become a teacher. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I'd been accepted to Harvard too. But the night before I was supposed to send my acceptance, Victoria had sat me down for one of her honest conversations. "Emma, darling," she'd said, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against her wine glass. "We need to be realistic about your capabilities. Harvard is for leaders, for people like Alex who can handle pressure. You're sensitive, artistic. Those aren't bad qualities, but they're not Whitmore qualities. Your father agrees that state school would be more appropriate for someone of your temperament." The way she said temperament made it sound like a disease. My father had stood in the doorway, silent, neither agreeing nor disagreeing, which was agreement enough. I'd torn up the Harvard acceptance letter that night, watching the pieces flutter into my trash can like dead leaves. The safety deposit box was larger than I'd expected, and heavier. Mr. Harrison helped me carry it to a private room, his expression curious but professional. "Your father was very specific about this box," he said quietly. "He came in just a month before he passed, spent several hours in here alone." That surprised me. My father had been sick for nearly a year, barely able to leave his bed in the final months. The fact that he'd made the effort to come here, to prepare this, meant something. But what? Inside the box were hundreds of letters, yellowed with age, tied together with faded blue ribbons. The first bundle was labeled simply Margaret, my mother's name. My hands trembled as I untied the ribbon, revealing love letters between my parents dating back to their college years. My father's handwriting, usually so controlled and businesslike, was loose and flowing, full of passion I'd never seen from him. "My darling Margaret," one began, "every moment without you feels like a year. You've awakened something in me I didn't know existed." I spent 3 hours in that bank room, reading letter after letter, watching my parents' love story unfold in their own words. They'd met at a small liberal arts college, both studying literature before my father was pulled back to take over the family business after his own father's sudden death. My mother had been a poet, published in several respected journals, something I'd never known. There were poems she'd written for my father, beautiful verses about love and dreams and the future they'd planned together. They'd wanted to travel the world, to write books, to live in a cottage by the sea. Instead, duty had called, and my father had answered, bringing my mother into the gilded cage of the Whitmore, on a legacy. But it was a letter near the bottom of the stack that made my blood run cold. It was in different handwriting, dated just 6 months after my mother's death. "Robert," it began, "I've done as you asked. The investigation has been closed, ruled as accidental, but I must warn you, if anyone ever discovers what really happened that night, what Victoria did, both of you could face serious consequences. The brake lines were definitely tampered with. I've destroyed all evidence as per our agreement, but my conscience compels me to keep this record. God forgive me. Detective James Morrison, retired." I read the letter 3 times, my mind refusing to process what it was saying. My mother's car accident, the one that had taken her life when I was 3, hadn't been an accident at all. Victoria had murdered her, and my father had covered it up. The room spun around me, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from falling. Everything I thought I knew, every memory, every moment of my life had been built on a foundation of lies and blood. There were more letters beneath, a whole correspondence between my father and this Detective Morrison, discussing payments, cover-ups, the guilt that was eating them both alive. And then, at the very bottom of the box, a sealed envelope with my name on it in my father's shaking handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 1 month ago. "My dearest Emma, if you're reading this, then I am gone, and you have discovered the terrible truth I've carried for 20 years. I don't ask for your forgiveness, I don't deserve it. But I need you to understand. Victoria came into my life when I was drowning in grief. Your mother's death had destroyed me, and I was barely able to care for you and Alex. Victoria seemed like salvation. It was only after we were married that she told me what she'd done, framing it as an act of love, clearing the way for us to be together. She had evidence that could have destroyed the company, could have left you and Alex with nothing. I was a coward. I chose money and stability over justice for your mother. But Victoria made one mistake. She didn't know that I'd been secretly recording our conversations for business purposes. I have recordings of her confession, of her threats, of everything. They're in a second safety deposit box, number 448, along with something else, your mother's true will. You see, Emma, your mother wasn't just a poet. She came from old money, older than the Whitmore fortune. She'd inherited everything from her grandmother, but had chosen to live simply, to keep it secret because she wanted to be loved for herself, not her wealth. That fortune, properly invested, is now worth approximately $200 million, and she left it all to you, her daughter, to be claimed when you turned 25 or upon my death, whichever came later. Victoria knew about this will. It's why she killed your mother, to prevent that fortune from leaving the Whitmore control. She thought that with your mother gone and me remarried to her, she could manipulate the situation. What she didn't know was that your mother had set up an ironclad trust that couldn't be touched without the original will and death certificate, which I've hidden all these years. I've been a coward, Emma, but I won't die as one. Use what I've left you. Bring justice for your mother. Claim what is rightfully yours. And know that despite my failures, my weakness, my terrible choices, I loved you. You reminded me so much of her. Your kindness, your love of books, your gentle spirit. I pushed you away because seeing you was like seeing Margaret's ghost, a daily reminder of my betrayal. That was my failing, not yours. You were never the disappointment. I was. All my love and all my regret. Your father. I sat in that small room as the bank closed around me, as Mr. Harrison knocked tentatively to check if I was all right, as the world outside continued spinning, unaware that everything had just changed. 20 years of feeling insufficient, of being told I wasn't enough, of accepting scraps of affection from a family that treated me like an outsider, all of it based on a lie so monstrous I could barely comprehend it. My mother had been murdered, my inheritance stolen, my entire life shaped by a woman who had killed to get what she wanted. The next morning, I didn't go to work. Instead, I went back to the bank and opened safety deposit box 448. Inside were the recordings my father had mentioned, old cassette tapes labeled with dates, and a thick legal envelope containing my mother's will, along with financial documents that made my head spin. $200 million. The number seemed impossible, abstract, like something from a movie rather than real life. But there it was in black and white, held in trust by a law firm in Boston, waiting for Margaret Whitmore's daughter to claim it. I spent the next week listening to those recordings in my tiny apartment, hearing Victoria's voice, cold and calculating, describing how she'd cut my mother's brake lines, how she'd watched her leave for her weekly poetry reading knowing she'd never make it home. She was weak, Victoria's recorded voice said. Pretty, yes, but weak. Robert needed a strong woman, someone who could help him build an empire, not some dreamy poet who wanted him to give it all up for love. My father's voice on the recordings was broken, horrified, but ultimately accepting. "What's done is done," he said in one. "We have to think of the children now." The children, Alex and me, but really, just Alex. Because from the moment Victoria entered our lives, I had been pushed to the margins, told I was too much like my mother, too soft, too impractical. Every criticism, every dismissive look, every moment of being made to feel less than, it all made sense now. Victoria couldn't stand to look at me because I was the living reminder of the woman she'd murdered. And my father couldn't stand to look at me because I was the living reminder of his cowardice. I hired a lawyer, Jonathan Chen, a former prosecutor who specialized in cold cases and had a reputation for taking on the powerful. When I played him the recordings and showed him the evidence, he actually whistled low. This is explosive," he said. "Victoria Whitmore is one of the most connected women in Connecticut. She's on every charity board, every social committee. Taking her down won't be easy." "I don't care about easy," I told him. "I care about justice." But I knew I couldn't just go to the police, not yet. Victoria had spent 20 years building her fortress of respectability and connections. I needed to be smart about this. I needed to gather allies, to build my case carefully, to make sure that when I struck, she wouldn't be able to wiggle free. The first person I went to was my Aunt Caroline, my mother's sister who lived in Maine. We'd been close when I was young, but Victoria had gradually pushed her out of our lives, claiming she was a bad influence. Caroline cried when she saw me on her doorstep. "Emma," she sobbed, pulling me into her arms. "I've wanted to contact you for so long, but Victoria threatened. She said she'd ruin me if I tried to see you." When I told her what I'd discovered, her tears turned to rage. "I knew it," she said. "I always knew there was something wrong about that accident. Margaret was the most careful driver I knew, and those roads were familiar to her. But the police said there was no evidence of foul play." Caroline gave me something invaluable, photographs and letters from my mother that she'd kept hidden all these years, pictures of my mother pregnant with me, glowing with happiness, letters where she described her dreams for my future. "I want Emma to be free," she'd written to Caroline. "Free to choose her own path, to follow her heart, not bound by duty and expectation like Robert is. I've set aside money for her, enough that she'll never have to depend on anyone. She'll be able to paint, to write, to teach, to do whatever brings her joy." My mother had wanted me to be exactly who I'd become. The teaching job Victoria mocked, the love of literature my father dismissed, the quiet life I'd chosen. My mother would have been proud. The realization broke something open in me, a grief I'd been carrying for 20 years without fully understanding its weight. I went back to Connecticut with a plan. The Whitmore Foundation was having its annual gala in 3 weeks, a massive charity event that Victoria had chaired for 15 years. Everyone who was anyone in Connecticut society would be there, including judges, police commissioners, media moguls. It would be the perfect stage for the truth to come out. But first, I needed to deal with Alex. My brother had called me several times since the will reading, his messages ranging from gloating to patronizing. "Emma, I heard you. Finally cleared out Dad's safety deposit box. I hope there were some nice memories in there for you. Listen, I know things are tight for you financially. I could throw some money your way, maybe get you a position at the company. Entry level, of course, but it would pay better than teaching." The condescension in his voice made my skin crawl, but I needed to know where he stood, whether he knew the truth about our mother's death. I invited him to lunch at a small cafe downtown, neutral territory. He showed up in a car worth more than I'd make in 5 years of teaching, his suit impeccable, his smile confident. "Emma," he said, sitting down across from me, "you look different." "How much do you know about how our mother really died?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. His smile faltered slightly. "She had a car accident. Tragic, but these things happen." "Do they?" I pulled out one of the photographs Caroline had given me, one of our mother holding baby Alex while pregnant with me. "Look at her, Alex. Really look at her. This was our mother. She was 28 years old when she died. She had her whole life ahead of her." Alex stared at the photo, and for a moment, I saw something crack in his carefully maintained facade. "Why are you doing this?" "Because she was murdered," I said quietly. "And our father helped cover it up." The color drained from his face. That's insane. You're talking about Victoria, about Dad. They would never—" "I have proof," I interrupted. "Recordings, letters, a full confession. Victoria cut our mother's brake lines because she wanted Dad and the Whitmore money, and Dad, our father, helped her cover it up because he was too weak to face the truth." Alex's hands were shaking as he reached for his water glass. "Even if this were true, which it's not, what could you possibly gain from bringing it up now? They're dead, Emma. Dad's dead. It's over." "Victoria's not dead," I pointed out. "She's very much alive and enjoying the life she stole from our mother." "She's my mother too," Alex said, but the words sounded hollow. "No," I said firmly. "She's the woman who murdered your mother and then spent 20 years making sure you forgot her. Tell me, Alex, what do you remember about our real mother?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Lavender," he finally said. "She smelled like lavender, and she used to sing. She'd sing while she cooked breakfast." His voice cracked slightly. "Victoria never sings." "Our mother left me something else," I said, making a decision to trust him with part of the truth. "Money. A lot of it. More than Dad left you. She came from wealth, Alex, old family money that she kept secret because she wanted to be loved for herself. Victoria knew about it. It's why she killed her." Alex stared at me, his worldview crumbling in real time. "How much?" "Enough to buy and sell Whitmore Industries several times over," I said. "But that's not the point. The point is that everything we were told, everything we believed about our family, about ourselves, was built on a murder and a cover-up. You were groomed to be the golden child, the heir, the perfect son. I was pushed aside, made to feel worthless, told I was too much like our mother. And all of it, every single moment of it, was orchestrated by a woman who killed our mother and a father too cowardly to stand up to her. "What do you want from me?" Alex asked, his voice barely a whisper. "I want you to decide who you are," I said. "Are you Robert Whitmore's son, willing to look the other way for the sake of money and position? Or are you Margaret Whitmore's son, someone who believes in justice and truth? Because in 3 weeks at the gala, I'm going to expose everything, and you need to decide which side you're on." I left him there, staring at the photograph of our mother, his perfect world in ruins. Part of me felt sorry for him. He'd been as much a victim as I had, just in a different way. While I'd been damaged by neglect and dismissal, he'd been damaged by false praise and manufactured success. Everything he'd achieved, he'd been told, was because he was special, superior, a true Whitmore. But in reality, he'd simply been the one Victoria could mold into her image, while I'd been too much like the woman she'd murdered to tolerate. The next 2 weeks were a whirlwind of preparation. Jonathan Chen and I built our case meticulously, ensuring that every piece of evidence was authenticated, every recording verified. We reached out quietly to Detective Morrison, long retired and living in Florida. When we told him we had his letter, he broke down crying. "I've lived with this guilt for 20 years, he said. "I was young, ambitious. Robert Whitmore offered me enough money to set my family up for life. But not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about that poor woman, about her children growing up without knowing the truth." He agreed to testify if needed, to finally tell the truth about what he'd covered up. We also tracked down the mechanic who'd examined my mother's car after the accident, now running his own shop in Vermont. He remembered the case clearly. "I told the police those brake lines had been cut," he said, "but then suddenly the case was closed, and I was told to forget what I'd seen. They threatened to revoke my license if I said anything. I had a family to feed, so I kept quiet. But I never forgot." More allies emerged from unexpected places. My father's secretary, Martha, who'd worked for him for 30 years, reached out after hearing I'd been asking questions. "I have things you need to see," she said, handing me a box of documents. "Your father asked me to destroy these years ago, but I couldn't. They're records of payments to various people, hush money to keep your mother's death quiet. He was paranoid about keeping records, even of things that could incriminate him. I think part of him wanted to be caught, wanted to be punished." The most surprising ally was Rebecca Morrison, Alex's ex-girlfriend from college. She contacted me through social media, saying she had information about Victoria. We met at a coffee shop, and she told me about her relationship with Alex and the real reason it had ended. "Victoria destroyed us," she said bitterly. "She hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on my family, found out my father had been in rehab for alcoholism years before I was even born, and threatened to expose it publicly if I didn't break up with Alex. She said I wasn't good enough for a Whitmore, that Alex needed someone from proper society. The thing is, Alex never knew. Victoria made me promise to tell him I'd fallen out of love, that I'd found someone else. It destroyed him, and it destroyed me too." "Why didn't you tell him the truth?" I asked. "Because Victoria showed me what she was capable of," Rebecca said quietly. "She had photos of my little sister, who was only 12 at the time, with notes about how accidents can happen to anyone. I was terrified. The woman is a monster, Emma. Whatever you're planning, please be careful." As the gala approached, I had one more crucial meeting. I went to see Judge Patricia Hawthorne, a woman known for her integrity and her intolerance of corruption. She'd gone to law school with my mother, though I only learned this from Caroline. When I showed her the evidence, her face went pale. "Margaret was one of my closest friends," she said. "When she died, I always felt something was off about it, but I was just starting my career, had no influence. If I'd known—" "You can help now," I said. "I need to make sure that when this comes out, Victoria can't use her connections to bury it." Judge Hawthorne nodded grimly. "I'll make sure the right people are at that gala," she promised. People who can't be bought or intimidated. Victoria Whitmore is going to face justice for what she did. The day of the gala arrived gray and drizzling, fitting weather for what was about to happen. I'd bought a dress for the occasion, a simple but elegant black gown that my teacher's salary definitely couldn't have afforded if I hadn't already claimed some of my inheritance. I'd also hired a private security team on Jonathan's advice. Victoria is dangerous, he'd warned. When cornered, she might do anything. I arrived at the hotel ballroom early, watching as the staff set up for what would be Victoria's last triumph. She'd planned everything meticulously: ice sculptures, a string quartet, flowers flown in from Ecuador. The theme was Legacy of Giving, which was ironically appropriate. Victoria had built her legacy on taking my mother's life, taking my father's integrity, taking my childhood, taking my brother's authenticity. Alex found me standing by the windows, looking out at the rain. He was in his tuxedo, looking every inch the Whitmore heir, but his eyes were hollow. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, "about who I am, whose son I want to be. And I remember more than I told you," he said quietly, "about our mother. I remember the day she died. Victoria was supposed to go to that poetry reading with her. It was at a library fundraiser, and as the newest Whitmore wife, she was expected to attend. But at the last minute, she said she felt sick, convinced Mom to go alone. After Mom left, I saw Victoria in the garage. She was washing her hands, scrubbing them raw. When she saw me watching, she told me I'd imagined it, that I'd been napping. For years, I believed I had dreamed it, but I didn't, did I?" "No," I said softly. "You didn't." "I want to be Margaret Whitmore's son," he said, his voice stronger. "I want to be the man our real mother would have been proud of. What do you need me to do?" The gala began at 7, with cocktails and mingling. Victoria held court in a stunning silver gown, accepting compliments and air kisses from Connecticut's elite. She hadn't acknowledged my presence yet, though I knew she'd seen me. In her mind, I was still the invisible daughter, the one who didn't matter. That was about to change. At 8:30, dinner was served, and at 9, Victoria took the stage for her annual speech about charity, legacy, and the importance of giving back. She was halfway through her prepared remarks about the Whitmore family's commitment to the community when I stood up. "I have something to add," I said, my voice carrying across the ballroom. Victoria's smile tightened. "Emma, dear, this isn't the time." "Oh, but it is," I said, walking toward the stage. Jonathan Chen and my security team moved with me, and I saw several uniformed police officers enter the ballroom. Judge Hawthorne had kept her promise. "You're talking about legacy, Victoria. Let's talk about the real Whitmore legacy." I reached the microphone, and Victoria tried to grab it from me, but Alex stepped onto the stage from the other side. "Let her speak, Mother," he said, and the word mother was laden with irony. 20 years ago, I began, my voice steady despite my racing heart. My mother, Margaret Whitmore, died in what was ruled a car accident. Except it wasn't an accident. She was murdered. Her brake lines were cut by someone who wanted her dead, someone who stood to gain everything from her death. The ballroom erupted in whispers, but I continued. That person is standing right here, in her silver gown and her stolen diamonds. Victoria Whitmore murdered my mother, and I have proof. "This is ridiculous," Victoria sputtered. "This is the rambling of a jealous child who—" "Is it?" I pulled out my phone, connected to the ballroom sound system, thanks to a helpful tech person Jonathan had bribed. "Let's let everyone hear it in your own words." I played the recording, Victoria's voice filling the ballroom, describing how she'd cut the brake lines, how she'd watched my mother leave for the last time. The gasps from the audience were audible, but I wasn't done. I played my father's voice too, his weak acceptance, his agreement to cover it up. "But there's more," I said as Victoria tried to flee the stage, only to be stopped by the police officers. Victoria didn't just kill my mother for my father. She killed her for money. My mother came from wealth, old family money that she'd inherited but kept secret. Victoria knew about it and knew that with my mother dead and my father remarried to her, she could control it all. Except she couldn't, because my mother was smarter than that. She left it all in a trust for me, her daughter, a trust worth $200 million. The number sent another wave of gasps through the crowd. I saw faces I recognized, society matrons who'd snubbed me for years, business associates who'd ignored me at family functions, all staring at me with new eyes. For 20 years, I continued, I was told I wasn't good enough, that I was the disappointing daughter, the failure who couldn't live up to the Whitmore name. But the truth is, I was punished for resembling the woman Victoria murdered. Every insult, every dismissal, every moment of being made to feel worthless was Victoria's way of destroying Margaret Whitmore's daughter, the way she destroyed Margaret Whitmore herself. Victoria finally found her voice. You can't prove any of this. Those recordings could be fake, could be... Actually, Detective Morrison said, stepping forward from where he'd been waiting in the wings. I can verify their authenticity because I was there. I helped cover up your crime, Mrs. Whitmore, and I've regretted it every day since. I'm here to tell the truth, finally. The police moved in then, handcuffing Victoria as she screamed about lawyers and connections and how she'd destroy everyone involved. But her power was already crumbling. I saw several society women actually applaud as she was led away, and I realized that Victoria had made more enemies than friends over the years. Her reign of terror was over. Alex came to stand beside me, taking the microphone. I need to say something too, he said, his voice shaking. I've been living a lie as much as my sister has. I was raised to believe I was special, superior, deserving of everything I was given, but it was all built on blood and lies. Our real mother, Margaret Whitmore, was murdered, and our father helped cover it up. Everything the Whitmore name has stood for since then has been a facade. Emma is the only real Whitmore here, the only one who inherited our mother's integrity along with her wealth. He turned to me. I'm renouncing my inheritance, he said, shocking everyone, including me. The $25 million, the company, all of it. It's blood money, and I don't want it. I want to start over, to become someone our real mother would have been proud of. The aftermath was chaotic. Victoria was arrested and charged with murder, with Detective Morrison's testimony and the recordings providing damning evidence. The story made national news. Society matron arrested for 20-year-old murder. The Whitmore scandal. How one woman's greed destroyed a family. Teacher inherits $200 million after exposing stepmother's crime. But for me, the headlines weren't the important part. The important part was sitting in Aunt Caroline's kitchen a week later, looking through photo albums of my mother, learning about the woman she'd been. She'd published 3 poetry collections under a pseudonym, had volunteered at literacy centers, had dreamed of opening a school for underprivileged children. She would have been so proud of you, Caroline said, watching me read one of my mother's poems about teaching. You became everything she hoped you'd be, even without her guidance. I thought about that a lot in the following weeks as I navigated my new reality. The money was overwhelming. I'd gone from barely making rent to being able to buy the entire building, but I knew what I wanted to do with it. I established the Margaret Whitmore Foundation, dedicated to literacy and education for underprivileged children. I kept teaching, but I also started the school my mother had dreamed of, a place where children who didn't fit the mold could learn and grow without being told they weren't enough. Alex and I slowly rebuilt our relationship. He'd kept his word about renouncing the inheritance, taking a job at a small startup, working his way up from the bottom for the first time in his life. It's hard, he admitted one day over coffee. We met weekly now, trying to learn who we were as siblings without Victoria's poison between us. But it's real. For the first time, what I achieve is actually mine. Rebecca Morrison came back into his life, and watching them together, seeing the love that had survived Victoria's interference, gave me hope that not everything she'd touched was permanently destroyed. The trial was brutal. Victoria's lawyers tried everything, claiming the recordings were coerced, that my father had been senile. that I'd fabricated evidence for the inheritance. But the truth was stronger than her lies. Detective Morrison's testimony was devastating, as was that of the mechanic who'd examined my mother's car. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict. Victoria Whitmore, the woman who'd ruled Connecticut society for 2 decades, was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At the sentencing, I gave a victim impact statement. I talked about growing up without a mother, about the psychological abuse Victoria had inflicted, about the life that had been stolen from our family. But I also talked about survival, about resilience, about the power of truth. Victoria Whitmore thought she could erase my mother, I said, looking directly at her. She thought she could diminish me until I disappeared too. But my mother's love, her values, her strength, they survived in me, even when I didn't know it. And now her legacy will live on, not in the twisted version Victoria created, but in the schools that will bear her name, the children who will be educated because of her, the poetry that will be republished and read by new generations. Victoria, you killed Margaret Whitmore's body, but you couldn't kill her spirit, and that spirit is what defeated you in the end. 6 months after the gala, I stood in front of the first Margaret Whitmore School for Creative Learning. It was built on the site of an old factory in the inner city, transformed into a beautiful space full of light and color and possibility. The students, kids who'd been written off by the system, labeled as problems or failures, were arriving for their first day. One girl, Maria, who reminded me painfully of myself at that age, stopped beside me. "Ms. Whitmore," she said shyly, "is it true what they say, that you were told you weren't good enough too?" "Every day for 20 years, I told her honestly. "But you were, weren't you? You were always good enough." "So are you," I said, and meant it. So is every child who walks through these doors. Sometimes the world tells us we're not enough because it's afraid of what we might become if we knew our true worth. The school was a massive success. Within a year, we had a waiting list, and I was planning to open 2 more locations. I hired teachers who understood what it was like to be different, to not fit the mold, to be told they were disappointments. We created a curriculum that valued creativity alongside academics, that taught children to question and dream and believe in themselves. I also published my mother's poetry, finally, under her real name. The collections were critically acclaimed, with one reviewer writing, "Margaret Whitmore's voice, silenced too soon by tragedy, speaks to us across decades with a freshness and urgency that makes her early death all the more heartbreaking. One can only imagine what literature lost when she was taken from us." But perhaps the most unexpected development was my relationship with Jonathan Chen, my lawyer. What had started as a professional relationship had evolved into friendship and then into something more. He was the first person I'd ever been with who knew my whole story from the beginning, who'd seen me at my lowest and still thought I was worth knowing. "You know I'm complicated," I told him one evening as we walked along the beach. I'd bought a house by the sea, the kind my mother had dreamed of. "Everyone's complicated," he replied. "You're just honest about it." We married 2 years after Victoria's conviction, in a small ceremony at the school, surrounded by students and teachers, and the family I'd chosen rather than the one I'd been born into. Alex was my man of honor. We'd decided traditional roles didn't suit us, and Caroline walked me down the aisle. "Your mother would have loved this," Caroline whispered as she handed me over to Jonathan. "She would have loved who you've become." I thought about that a lot. Who I'd become versus who I was supposed to be. According to Victoria's plan, I should have remained the invisible daughter, teaching high school for a modest salary, accepting scraps of affection and approval, never knowing my worth. Instead, I'd become someone who fought for truth, who built schools, who published poetry, who loved and was loved in return. The letters from the safety deposit box, I kept them all, even the painful ones. They were evidence of a love story cut short, of a tragedy that shaped generations, of the complex nature of truth and family and justice. Sometimes I read them to remind myself of where I came from, of what was lost and what was found. One letter in particular I return to often. It was from my mother to me, written when she was pregnant, imagining who I might become. "My darling Emma," she'd written, "I don't know who you'll be yet, but I know you'll be magnificent. Not because of the money I'm leaving you, though I hope that gives you freedom, but because you're made of love and hope and dreams. The world might try to tell you you're too much or not enough, but don't listen. You are exactly right, exactly as you're meant to be. Follow your heart, trust your instincts, and never let anyone dim your light. All my love, always and forever, Mom." I had that letter framed and hung in my office at the school, where I could see it every day. It reminded me that my mother had loved me before I'd even taken my first breath, that I'd been wanted and cherished and believed in, even if I hadn't known it for so many years. 5 years after the trial, I received a letter from Victoria in prison. I almost threw it away unopened, but curiosity won. It was shorter than I'd expected. "Emma, I suppose you expect an apology. You won't get one. I did what I had to do to survive and thrive in a world that gives women few options for power. Your mother had everything handed to her: beauty, wealth, a poetic soul. Some of us had to fight for every scrap. But I'll tell you this, you're more like me than you want to admit. That strength you used to bring me down, that came from surviving me. In a twisted way, I made you who you are. Think about that." Victoria. I did think about it. She wasn't entirely wrong. The strength I'd found, the determination to seek justice, the ability to stand up in that ballroom and expose the truth, some of that had been forged in the crucible of her cruelty. But she was also completely wrong. My strength didn't come from her abuse. It came from surviving it. It came from my mother's love, even in absence. It came from my own refusal to be erased. I wrote back just once. "You're right that you shaped me, Victoria, but not in the way you think. You showed me exactly who I never want to be. Every kind word I speak, every child I help, every moment of compassion I choose, that's me being everything you're not. My mother's love survived your hate. That's not your victory, it's your defeat. Don't contact me again." She didn't. Alex found his own path to redemption. He'd worked his way up in the startup, eventually becoming a partner. But more importantly, he'd learned who he was without the Whitmore name and fortune propping him up. He married Rebecca in a ceremony very different from the society wedding Victoria would have planned. Outdoors, simple, genuine. Their daughter, Margaret, Maggie, was born a year later, and watching Alex as a father, gentle and present, and emotional in ways our father never was, healed something in both of us. "I want her to know she's enough," he told me one day as we watched Maggie play at the beach. "No matter what she chooses to do or be, she's enough." "She will," I assured him. "We'll make sure of it." The schools continued to grow. By the 7th year, we had 12 Margaret Whitmore schools across the country, each one a beacon for children who'd been written off, labeled, dismissed. We had an incredible success rate. 90% of our students went on to college, many of them the first in their families to do so. But more than the statistics, it was the individual stories that mattered. There was James, who'd been labeled learning disabled until we discovered he was actually dyslexic and brilliant, just needing different tools to learn. He went on to become an engineer. There was Sophia, whose parents had been told she'd never amount to anything because she was too emotional, who became a successful therapist specializing in helping other sensitive children. There was David, who'd been expelled from 3 schools for behavioral problems that turned out to be undiagnosed ADHD, and who became an innovative tech entrepreneur. Each success story felt like a victory, not just for the children, but for my mother, for the life she'd wanted to live, the difference she'd wanted to make. On what would have been my mother's 60th birthday, we held a poetry festival at the original school. We'd republished all her work, and young poets came to read their own pieces inspired by hers. The auditorium was packed, and as I listened to voice after voice bringing poetry to life, I felt my mother's presence so strongly it took my breath away. Caroline, now in her 70s but still spry, sat beside me. "She's here," she whispered, squeezing my hand. "In every word, every child, every dream you've made real, she's here." That night, I went home to the house by the sea to Jonathan and our own daughter, Hope, born 3 years after our wedding, named for what my mother had never lost and what I'd finally found. As I tucked Hope into bed, she asked me the question I'd been waiting for since she'd become old enough to understand our family's history. "Mommy, why did the bad lady hurt Grandma Margaret?" I'd thought about how to answer. This, how to explain human cruelty to a 5-year-old without destroying her innocence. "Sometimes," I said carefully, "people want things that aren't theirs so badly that they do terrible things to get them. The bad lady wanted money and power, and she thought hurting Grandma Margaret was the only way to get them. But it wasn't really hers even after she took it? No, baby. Things you steal are never really yours. They're just things you have until the truth catches up." And the truth always catches up? I thought about the 20 years Victoria had lived free, the 2 decades of luxury and respect she'd enjoyed while my mother lay in the ground. Not always as fast as we'd like, I admitted. But yes, usually, the truth finds a way. Hope seemed satisfied with that, but then asked one more question. "Mommy, are you sad you didn't have a mom?" "I did have a mom," I told her. "I just didn't get to keep her as long as I wanted, but her love stayed with me, even when she couldn't. And now I have Aunt Caroline, who tells me stories about her. And I have all the poems she wrote and the schools with her name and you, because you're part of her too, part of the love that started with her and continues through us. Like a chain? Like a chain that can't be broken, no matter how hard someone tries." After Hope fell asleep, I stood on my deck, looking out at the ocean, thinking about chains, the chains of love that connect us across death and time, the chains of truth that eventually bind those who try to escape them, the chains we break and the ones we forge. My phone buzzed with a text from one of the school principals. A new student had enrolled, a girl whose stepfather had told her she was worthless, stupid, a waste of space. The principal wanted me to know because the girl's story was so similar to mine. I texted back that I'd visit tomorrow, that I'd tell the girl my story if it would help, that she wasn't alone. This was my life now, not the life Victoria had planned for me, not even the life my father had expected, but perhaps the life my mother had dreamed of when she set aside that fortune, when she wrote those poems, when she loved me before I was even born. A life of purpose, of truth, of helping children discover their worth in a world that too often tried to convince them they had none. The Whitmore name, which had once stood for power and prestige and eventually scandal and murder, now stood for something else entirely. It stood for second chances, for education, for the belief that every child deserved to know their worth. Alex and I had reclaimed it, transformed it from our father's legacy of cowardice and Victoria's legacy of cruelty into our mother's legacy of love. 10 years after that night in the ballroom, when I'd exposed the truth, I was invited to speak at a conference on justice and redemption. The organizer introduced me as the woman who brought down Victoria Whitmore. But that wasn't how I saw myself. I was the woman who'd found her mother's letters. I was the woman who'd chosen truth over comfort. I was the woman who'd discovered that sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money or property, but the strength to stand up and say, "This is wrong, and I won't let it continue." In my speech, I talked about the cost of truth, how it had meant giving up the only family I'd known, facing public scrutiny, reliving trauma. But I also talked about the price of silence, how it had cost my father his integrity, my brother his authenticity, and me 20 years of believing I wasn't enough. "We all have boxes of letters," I said to the audience. maybe not literal ones in safety deposit boxes, but truths we've hidden, stories we haven't told, injustices we've accepted because speaking up seems too hard or too dangerous. But I'm here to tell you that the cost of silence is always higher than the cost of truth. It may not seem like it in the moment, but silence is a debt that compounds interest, and eventually, someone has to pay. After the speech, a young woman approached me, tears in her eyes. "My stepmother," she began, then stopped, unable to continue. "I know," I said, because I did. I could see it in her eyes, the familiar look of someone who'd been told they were less than, unwanted, a burden. "Tell me your name." "Rachel." "Rachel, do you have anyone you trust? Anyone who knew you before your stepmother?" She nodded. "My grandmother, but my stepmother says she's senile, that she makes things up." "Your grandmother isn't senile," I said firmly. "That's what they do. They isolate us from anyone who might tell us we're valuable. Go to your grandmother, tell her everything, and if you need help, real help, call me." I handed her my card. "You're not alone, and you're not crazy, and you're definitely not worthless." She called 3 weeks later. Her grandmother had not only believed her, but had hired a lawyer. It turned out her late mother had also left her an inheritance that her stepmother had been trying to access. The patterns repeat, but so does the resistance. I often thought about my father in those years after the truth came out. He'd been weak, certainly, complicit in covering up murder, absolutely. But I'd come to understand that he'd also been trapped by his own choices, each compromise making the next one easier until he was so deep in the lie that the truth seemed impossible. His final act, leaving me those letters, the evidence, the truth, had been his only attempt at redemption. It wasn't enough, could never be enough, but it was something. On the 15th anniversary of discovering the letters, I visited his grave for the first time. I'd avoided it, unable to reconcile the father who'd failed me with the man who'd ultimately given me the tools for justice. But standing there, looking at the headstone that read, "Robert Whitmore, beloved husband and father," I realized I'd been carrying anger that was poisoning me the way Victoria's hatred had poisoned our family. "I don't forgive you," I said quietly to the stone, "but I understand you. You were weak when we needed you to be strong, silent when we needed you to speak. But in the end, you gave me the truth, and the truth set us all free. Rest in whatever peace you can find." I left a single white rose on his grave, not for him, but for the man he could have been if he'd been stronger, the father we'd deserved but never got. Victoria died in prison 5 years later. Heart attack, the report said, though I wondered if it was more that her heart finally couldn't sustain the weight of all that hatred. She'd spent her final years filing appeal after appeal, each one denied, her fortune depleted by legal fees, her society friends long gone. The woman who'd killed for money and status died alone and penniless, which felt like the kind of justice my mother might have appreciated, poetic, complete, inevitable. I didn't attend her funeral. Neither did Alex. The only people there were a priest and 2 gravediggers. The woman who'd orchestrated elaborate galas and commanded rooms full of powerful people was laid to rest with no one to mourn her, no legacy except the cautionary tale she'd become. But we did hold a memorial for our mother, finally, properly. 25 years after her death, we held a celebration of Margaret Whitmore's life at the original school. Hundreds came, students, teachers, people who'd read her poetry, people who'd been helped by the foundation. Caroline spoke about the sister she'd loved. Alex spoke about the mother he'd barely known but had come to understand through her writings. I read one of her poems, the last one she'd written before her death. "Love is the only inheritance that matters, the only wealth that multiplies when divided, the only power that grows from surrender. Leave your children not gold, but courage, not silver, but strength, not diamonds, but the unshakable knowledge that they are loved, have always been loved, will always be loved, even when love seems impossibly far away." After everyone else had spoken, a surprise guest took the microphone. Detective Morrison, now in his 80s, frail but determined. "I came to apologize," he said, his voice shaking. "Not to you, Emma, though I owe you that too, but to Margaret Whitmore. I failed her. I chose money over justice, comfort over truth. I've lived with that shame for 25 years, but watching what Emma has built, seeing these schools, these children given chances they wouldn't have had. This is Margaret's true justice. This is her victory, and I'm honored to witness it, even though I don't deserve to." He was crying by the end, and so was I, and so was most of the room. Because that was the real truth about justice. It wasn't just about punishing the guilty. It was about honoring the victims, about building something beautiful from the ashes of tragedy, about ensuring that the evil done in darkness was overcome by good done in the light. The Margaret Whitmore Foundation now operates 53 schools across the country. We've educated over 10,000 children who were told they weren't enough, weren't smart enough, weren't worthy enough. We've published not just my mother's poetry, but anthologies of student work, giving voice to children who'd been silenced. We've proven again and again that every child has worth, has potential, has the right to be seen and valued and educated. Hope, now 15, volunteers at the schools, tutoring younger students. She has my mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and her father's sense of justice. She knows our whole story, every dark corner of it, and she's determined to be part of the light that pushes back against that darkness. "Mom," she said to me recently, "do you think Grandma Margaret would be proud of us?" "I know she would," I told her. "But more importantly, we're proud of ourselves. We took the worst thing that ever happened to our family and turned it into something that helps other families. We took Victoria's cruelty and answered it with kindness. We took lies and replaced them with truth. And we took a box of old letters and built an empire of schools," Hope added with a grin. "That too." As I write this, sitting in my office at the original school, I can hear children laughing in the courtyard. They're playing some complicated game they've invented, full of rules that make sense only to them, full of joy that can't be contained by classroom walls. These children, many of whom came to us broken by systems and families that failed them, are healing. They're learning not just math and science and literature, but also their own worth, their own power, their own voices. This is my mother's legacy, not the money, though that made it possible, but the belief that every child deserves to be loved and valued and given the chance to become who they're meant to be. This is my father's redemption, not forgiveness, which he never earned, but the transformation of his cowardice into courage in the next generation. This is Alex's and my triumph over Victoria, not her imprisonment, though that was necessary, but our refusal to let her poison define us. And this is my story, the girl who was given a box of old letters instead of millions, who found in those yellowed pages a truth that changed everything, who learned that sometimes the greatest inheritance is the courage to stand up and say, "This is wrong," and the strength to make it right. I think about that day in the lawyer's office sometimes, how humiliated I'd felt, how small and worthless. I think about Victoria's smirk and Alex's uncomfortable silence and my father's will being read like a grocery list. I think about how I almost didn't go to the bank, almost let that safety deposit box sit there unopened, the truth locked away forever. But I did go. I did open it. I did read every letter, even the ones that broke my heart, especially the ones that broke my heart. And in doing so, I discovered that my worth had never been determined by what my father left me, or what Victoria thought of me, or what society expected of me. My worth had been there all along, in my mother's love, in my own strength, in my refusal to accept injustice, even when it was dressed up in designer clothes and living in a mansion. The box of old letters turned out to be worth more than $25 million. It was worth the truth. It was worth justice. It was worth discovering who I really was. Not the disappointing daughter, not the family failure, but Margaret Whitmore's daughter, heir to a legacy of love and poetry and strength that no amount of cruelty could destroy. And that confession that changed everything? It wasn't just Victoria's confession on those tapes. It was my father's confession in his final letter, his admission of weakness and failure. It was Detective Morrison's confession of corruption and regret. It was Alex's confession that he'd been living a lie. It was my own confession, finally, that I was enough, had always been enough, would always be enough. The truth really does set you free, but first, it tends to destroy everything you thought you knew. And from that destruction, if you're brave enough, you can build something better, something real, something worthy of the love that started it all. My mother has been dead for 30 years now, but her love lives on in every child who walks through our school doors, in every poem published under her name, in every moment that hope laughs with the same joy Margaret must have had before Victoria stole it. Love like that doesn't die. It just transforms, spreads, multiplies, becomes something larger than any one person could have imagined. Victoria thought she'd won when she cut those brake lines. She thought she'd secured her future, her fortune, her place in society. But all she'd really done was plant the seeds of her own destruction and the seeds of something beautiful she could never have imagined, a network of schools bearing the name of the woman she'd murdered, thousands of children learning and growing and thriving, a foundation that will outlast any fortune, any scandal, any tragedy. In the end, the box of old letters was worth everything. Not because of what it revealed about the past, but because of what it made possible for the future. Every child who learns to read in a Margaret Whitmore school, every young poet who finds their voice, every kid who discovers they're not a disappointment, but a miracle, they're all part of those letters, part of that love, part of the confession that changed everything. The confession that love is stronger than hate, the truth is stronger than lies, that a mother's love for her daughter can survive even death, even decades, even the most carefully orchestrated cruelty. The confession that we are all enough, have always been enough, will always be enough. The confession that changed everything. End.